Okay, well, if everyone's ready to begin, I have that sense from the room. I'd like to ask you and joining me in welcoming our first speaker, who is our second keynote of our conference. Yesterday, as many of you know, we enjoyed the intelligent and gripping and very salient words of Dr. Barbara Perry, whose expertise on hate crimes and the proliferation of ideologically based extremism, again, is a terrible irony today. The second piece of that is about how we, as communities and as individuals and as families, cope with trauma following incidences of terror and hatred. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our second keynote speaker, Dr. Omar Reda, who, as I said in the beginning, is an expert in psychotraumology, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and trauma-informed care. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Omar Reda.
Hi, good morning again. Assalamu alaikum. So, very ironically, I started a dialogue or conversation with a recruiting agency in New Zealand about a couple of weeks ago, because I wanted to do what we call locum. I wanted to practice as a psychiatrist for maybe a couple of months in New Zealand, because my wife said that's the safest place on earth, and she always wanted to go to that country. So we had a very interesting conversation this morning. Yeah, but rather than falling into despair and fear, I wanted today to focus on healing and resilience. So forgive me if I don't talk much about the problem. I rather talk about the solution, because everybody, very clearly, the problem is very obvious. So also, I wanted to share words of wisdom from one of my colleagues. He's going to be speaking this afternoon, hopefully. He's driving now from Fargo in the middle of a very heavy storm. So we wish Dr. Andrew McLean luck as he drives here. But he wanted us to share maybe the acronym FACTS. FACTS in the face of community crisis. If you can remember, F stands for fostering hope. So don't preach despair and don't lose hope. This is very important today. The second one is act with purpose. So many of us, we might want to take actions individually, but let us try to be organized and try to be rational, because we want to turn the anger into a productive celebration of memory for those who died. The C stands for connection with others. So many times, like when there is a disaster, we self-deploy. We are very passionate, so we take our bags and we go to a war zone or natural disaster zone. That's not usually the best approach if you can be part of a team and not self-deploy, because maybe people will remind you to take care of yourself and know your boundaries. Otherwise, you might end up in compassion fatigue. And this takes us to point number 4, which is the T stands for taking care of yourself. There are very few of us who are doing this work, and we don't want to burn out. So make sure you are also taking care of yourself, taking care of others. And the last one, the S stands for search for meaning. So make sure somehow when there is nonsense incidents like what happened in New Zealand, we might try to make sense out of nonsense situation, and we get very confused, because it's very confusing, the human violence and why we do what we do. But yesterday, I was very inspired. There are many great speakers, and some of them, they said, let us ask about who is not in the room. Let us maybe look at compassion to the other people who are committing these heinous crimes. For me, a search for meaning today, it's very difficult for me to find sacred space in my heart for that. Today, I cannot. Maybe tomorrow, maybe this afternoon, I don't know. I have done work in reconciliation in Libya and with the Syrian refugees because of my home country, Libya. I was in the city of Benghazi, and you remember there was almost a genocide on March 19th, 2011, when Gaddafi troops invaded the city of Benghazi, promising to wipe out the whole city, killing 750,000 people, including all of my family members. So that day, I did not have compassion for the troops because they wanted to kill my family. But I ended up having to heal my own PTSD and working a lot on reconciliation for people who fought for and against Mr. Gaddafi, and those now who are fighting for or against Mr. Bashar al-Assad in Syria. So reconciliation work is something that's very dear and near to my heart. It takes lots of self-discipline, I would say, to try to do this kind of healing. Because one day I was invited to give a speech at a city that was labeled as a pro-Gaddafi still, even though Gaddafi was dead a long time ago. But some of his supporters were still controlling a number of Libyan cities. So I went and I gave a speech that focused on healing and resilience and reconciliation and looking with compassion to each other trauma story. And somebody, if you remember Gaddafi, one day he said, you are nothing but rats. You are rats, I'm gonna find you under your beds, in your closets, I'm gonna squish you like I squish rats. So one of his supporters came after the lecture and she said, even though you are a rat, you are a very polite one. She was willing to extend a hand, for reconciliation. She wanted to shake my hand, and I was very excited. This is a beginning. So we can hopefully, at one point in our ugly history, end up with some kind of meaning and reconciliation. But today, just wanted to be very honest with you. I find it difficult for me today to do any reconciliation work, because I want to celebrate those who are the victims today. Hopefully their families will turn out to be survivors and they will thrive out of this experience. But I was wondering, what if I was in one of these two mosques? What if my wife and 3 daughters were praying during that Friday prayer? So I can only imagine. I don't ask me why, but I watched the video, 7-minute video. It was horrific. One of the sisters was begging him. She was saying, please help, and he helped her with 2 bullets in her head. So it's very ugly and graphic video. I don't encourage you to watch it. Sometimes I do impulsive things like that. Like I watched 13 Reasons Why, all the 13 episodes, and people are asking me, why do you do this? Because I want to learn why people, embark on such dark and hateful ideologies. So I wanted to maybe through this conference study this phenomenon, but without externalizing it, without saying, oh, these are Muslims or refugees and doesn't affect us. It comes to our very backyards. This happens everywhere, unfortunately. I have an open door policy in my house. I encourage my 3 daughters to always come to their dad whenever they feel they want to talk. And my oldest, she came at 3 in the morning. She wanted to share a nightmare. And I am like, it's 3 in the morning, and she said, too bad. You told us we have an open door policy here. So she shared that she was receiving death threats. She was only 12-year-old. It was, during the election season, and she said, are we moving to Canada? And I am like, I love Canada, but we're not moving. She was very anxious about the hateful messages that she was hearing. So I was very happy that she trusted me enough to, share her anxiety. And I wanted this to be a practice in all of our homes. I want our homes to turn into safe spaces for our children, because they are facing a lot. And we know this kind of trauma might affect generations. So focusing on that through family bonding, through youth empowerment, is a work that's very dear and near to my heart. So my middle child came, and she was giving us lots of attitude. And I'm like, are you doing the same at school? And she's like, of course not. And I am like, okay, why are you doing this at home? And she said, maybe I feel safe at home. I'm like, okay, we have another psychologist in the room. But I mean, it was an eye-opener because children, they act out when they feel unsafe, but only when we provide them with a safe space, they will actually feel safe again to share their emotions. Like even my youngest, this was only a couple weeks ago, she's a very bubbly and happy child, but that day she was in very foul mood. And we wanted to reason with her, and some people suggested maybe she should go for a time out. And I said, no, we have the practice of time in this home. So I took her to her room, and we sat down together, and I said, Baba, remember, we have an open door policy. This is a safe house. And she started crying. She said, I cannot say the words. She lost her voice to her trauma story. And I said, Baba is a safe person. This is a safe house. And what bothers you? And she also shared a nightmare that her whole family died in a flooding. So after she spat out that trauma story, she was able to go back and play and be the happy child again. So we need to honor people's voices and their trauma stories and give them brave spaces. I started calling them safe spaces, but somebody challenged that word. They said a safe space is a space where you feel safe, but maybe you don't feel safe enough to speak up. So they wanted us to use brave spaces. Said brave spaces maybe give people courage to actually share without feeling they need to put a mask or walk on eggshells around others. And the use of language is very important, especially when it comes to the work with refugees. Like in the city of Portland, where I practice, we are very proud to call ourselves a sanctuary city for refugees. We said everybody is welcome here. We have about 66 Syrian families right now. We were promised 500 families, but because of the travel ban and everything, we only have 66 so far. But somebody challenged the use of the word sanctuary. They said sanctuary means a space where you feel safe inside, where everybody outside is the enemy. And I'm like, okay, we don't want that dynamic to happen, because that's not what the refugees should feel or the general public should feel. So when it comes to our refugee brothers and sisters, we call them undocumented, illegal immigrants, foreign aliens, and very interesting names. When I was going through medical school, University of Tennessee in Memphis, I was called foreign medical graduate. I hated that. And we petitioned the agencies, and eventually we were called international medical students. I felt much better. Yeah, I'm not foreigner anymore. And it's very interesting. Like people would say the refugees are only people with accent, or they dress differently, or we know maybe most people in the room, they come from somewhere else. And this is the beauty of this country, the beauty of the United States, that I hope will continue to be a beautiful country despite all of the hate that's going on right now. But we are a fruit salad. We don't have to be the melting pot and everybody is a soup. We are very exotic as a fruit salad. We look different, we smell different, we taste delicious that way, and that's okay. I heard yesterday in Canada you guys use mosaic rather than melting pot. That's maybe more fantastic way to put it. But I hope one day we will just put aside our differences and focus on our shared humanity. And we know politicians and the media, they play on this fear tactic. They will say, you cannot be Syrian and Canadian at the same time. You have divided loyalty. You cannot be loyal to this country if you come from somewhere else. That's very interesting. I think many, many newcomers are very loyal to this country because this is maybe the first time that they felt safe. And we wanted to continue that practice because I think people don't leave their homes out of luxury or because they wanted to. Nobody leaves because it's a choice. Usually, some people blame a mom who will throw her children in the river or in the ocean. I remember Prophet Moses, alayhi salam, when his mom threw him in the river. Why did she do that? Because water was more merciful than the Pharaoh. Her son was about to be killed, and that was the safest place a mom can, place her child. So we really have to look with compassion to people's stories and see why they do what they do. Because when they leave home, they carry their trauma story with them. You can see in this very interesting picture how there is lots of trauma, but also there is a little bit of hope. You can see flowers, you can see she's walking towards the future. But if we don't acknowledge the trauma story, I'm afraid, we will repeat cycles of dysfunction. We will play the trauma in our everyday dynamics. When I feel irritable, usually, or I get angry because I have an argument with my boss, I cannot take it on them. I take it on my wife, and she will take it on the children. I have 3 beautiful daughters, and they have 3 beautiful cats, so they can take their anger on the cats. We call it displacement in psychiatry. It's okay, it's a defense mechanism. And usually the trauma story is the big invisible elephant in the room. It's not only when it comes to refugees. I work with trauma survivors of different kinds of trauma. One day, I was in my psychodynamic psychotherapy session with my long-term client, and she was very irritable, very restless in the room. And this is the first time I see that there is dynamic inside the room. There's a big elephant between us. And they said there is something in our interpersonal space. You don't feel safe here. And she said, don't worry about it. And I insisted. And she said, you are wearing a different kind of perfume today. You have a different body odor. And I said, yeah. And she said, this is the exact kind that my grandfather was wearing when he sexually assaulted me. So I had to terminate that session immediately and go home and take a shower. But if I did not acknowledge her trauma story that day, there was no benefit of that session. And sometimes it's very subtle like this. But sometimes you need to dig a little bit deeper. Like they brought me an 18-year-old child, and they said, oh, the poor thing, she's schizophrenic, she's hearing voices. And I wanted to listen to her trauma story because she did not look schizophrenic, she was high functioning. She did not fit all the criteria. So she told me when I was 10-year-old, I lost my father for a car accident. And that's it. That's all her trauma story until I turned 18. And my mom told me, oh, by the way, your father was intoxicated that day, and 2 women died in that car accident. It was a head-on collision, and her voices that she was hearing are 2 women screaming. And she was hearing them only when she was asleep. So they are actually nightmares, not voices. And the diagnosis is PTSD, not schizophrenia. So usually if we don't, listen to people's stories, we might take them down very, very dark and dangerous ways. We can give them the wrong diagnosis, the wrong treatment plan, the wrong medication. And violence, unfortunately, is here to stay. I'm afraid, I usually try to be hopeful and optimistic, but we can see violence is happening on a daily basis, and you can only cover your face as a Statue of Liberty because of all of the atrocities that are witnessed when a child drowns because he tried to be safe from the Syrian war, when a child is sitting in the back of an ambulance, he didn't know why his house was bombed. And this morning, we woke up to Brenton, who decided to take the lives of 49 people and maybe more. And this is the most glory I will give him. There's his picture today on the screen, because we want to reclaim our narrative and take back our voice. We don't want him to speak up for anyone, because ISIS has been speaking up for me and my religion, and I have no interest in them doing that anymore. That's why I'm doing the work I do with refugees and with trauma survivors. You can see trauma comes in all kinds of ways. Like I have a child in the bottom who's from Libya. He was, gunned down by a sniper while he was going to school. And you can see he ruptured all of his intestine. Alhamdulillah, thank God he survived and he recovered physically. But he told me, Ammu, which means uncle. He said, uncle, every time I go to school, I have to watch over my shoulder. So he's being hyper-vigilant, and maybe he will end up developing PTSD and stuff like that. The children next to him are brother and sister from Syria. They're not watching 4th of July fireworks. They're watching bombs coming down to their home. A child from Burma, a Rohingya refugee, he just watched as his whole village was burnt down. And we know our brothers and sisters from the Latino community, how much they're going through. We know that some people in the Chinese provinces are living in concentration camps right now. About 800,000 Muslims are going through that. And we know also everyday shooting is happening. This is in the United States. And we are talking about now, like 2019, and people are still doing this kind of terror. Children go to school and never come back. This is a parent's worst nightmare. So when it comes to rather focusing on healing than on the trauma itself, we decided to launch a program. We called it Project Untangled. Untangled, we call it this way because trauma seems to tangle many families and affects many family dynamics. So we started with improving family relationship. We do parenting seminars and workshops. We work closely with DHS because some families are going through a rough time trying to learn the system. And some people are chasing the American dream, but they are losing the American dream chasing it because they go and they try to work for 2 jobs and they try to chase a green card and try to learn the English language. I saw a Somali boy who was very, very anxious. And we sat down with him and he said, the reason I'm anxious because I don't see my dad. He leaves home 6 in the morning, comes back 12 midnight, 7 days a week. He's working very hard to, fulfill the American dream. And we said, brother, you are losing the American dream. You don't see your children. And he said, I'm taking care of their materialistic needs. And we say, what about their emotional needs? Because this is a comprehensive approach to the psyche of the children. And I believe if we improve family dynamics, we can do lots of healing for our community. We see lots of dysfunction when it comes to marriage dynamics because of the trauma story that plays behind closed doors. So there is high rate of divorce in the refugee community. So we try to be proactive rather than reactive. So we have a safe space once a month, brave space. And usually we give it a very benign, title. I don't call it a psychosocial healing or come and talk about mental health in the refugee community. We call it like behind closed doors. So people, they are curious about, okay, what's going on there? We called it 13 Reasons Why. And that was the most heavily attended workshop. We have about 200 people show up. Most of them are youth. And we talked about suicide and psychosocial healing and resilience and self-care, stuff like that. We call it like out of the shadows for, people with the special needs. And so give voice to the voiceless. So we tried every month to have a different theme, and we provide the community with food and with social activities. I do play and art therapy with the children. I give a short talk to the parents, and then they mingle. And because especially Syrians, which is the heaviest number of refugees we have in Portland, they love socialization. This is very important to them. So we gather them together and they try to support each other that way. Me and my wife, we took 73 teenagers to a 3-day camp. I don't know what we were thinking. But we called it Camp Sila. Sila in Arabic means connection. So we wanted them to connect with one another, with nature, with the high power, with their inner self. So these are teenagers, and none of them was allowed to have access to their cell phone for 3 days. And they did not miss their phones because we made it very interactive. It was very well organized. And out of 73, we took 30 refugees. 30 refugees. And we did not tell any child who was a refugee and who wasn't until day 3. We said, do you know there are 30 people, refugees from Syria among you? They had no clue. Because the children, they learn the English language very quickly. The children who are not refugees maybe also have an accent and so on. It was a very beautiful encounter that made people feel welcome and welcoming at the same time. This is my wife's organization. She called it Daughters of Eve. And she tried to give voice to the Muslim women, especially teenagers. I tried to compete with her. I called my organization Sons of Adam. It was an epic failure. So you can see how attractive their events are. Ours are like, okay, let us get some pizza. We have a once a month mental health clinic that's culturally sensitive as much as we can. We call it the Ummah Clinic, Oregon Muslim Medical Association. So people who really needed to be referred because they needed very specific cultural or religious advice, we try to provide that in the safety of a once a month clinic. This is some of the work I did in Libya. Every child in the room is an orphan. They lost their parents, unfortunately, to the war. And we try to do just psychosocial activities with them. We wanted them to focus on art and play therapy. And this is something that we are working on right now. It is a very important cartoon about a Syrian refugee child. I am the psychosocial consultant for that movie, hopefully coming up in 2020. And just talks about how use of art, it's the poems of Rumi. You guys know Rumi, eh? So she left Syria with the Rumi book, and she found lots of healing going through the rituals of how to apply his words of wisdom, even in the year 2019. So hopefully, just watch out for this movie. I have very good feelings that it will be used for psychosocial education, for reconciliation, and for healing, not only for the refugee community, but for the general public as well. These are some of my books. One of them is in the room right now. It's called Islamophobia and Psychiatry. If you work through an organization, you can download it for free. I highly recommend that. It was just published less than 2 months ago. I wrote a chapter about the refugee experience, and I wrote a book about generation of ISIS. And ISIS, I disclaim that it's not only the Islamic State. There is no such thing as Islamic State, but I wanted to make the bold claim that ISIS stands for anybody with deviant and extremist ideology, regardless of their background. So you'll hear that maybe what happened this morning is also under generation of ISIS. If we don't stand up for hate, all of us might be living under very angry generation, which I call the generation of ISIS. And why do I do this work? Because it's very personal. When I was 6 years old, my 14-year-old sister, she went blind. She was only 14. We didn't know what was going on with her. And she died because of brain cancer. It's called medulloblastoma. So I always say medulloblastoma is a very beautiful name, but it's a very ugly killer that I have issues with. So I wanted to become brain surgeon. I went to medical school, worked very hard, and was in the OR, and then I didn't notice anything because I was on the floor. So after I fainted 3 times, I was kicked out of the OR. They said, we will make you pass your surgical rotation, but never come back to the OR. That was their exact words. So I snuck into the OR one more time when my baby was born. My wife had C-section, and I remember as I can see her face coming out, I couldn't feel anything else. And I can hear the gynecologist saying, "Here we go, another one on the floor." So looks like I couldn't be a surgeon. So I decided to become a psychiatrist instead, something to do with the mind. And I love what I do. I mean, this is the most beautiful field of medicine, I believe. And in the year 2014, I lost my nephew. He was captured by ISIS in the city of Benghazi. I don't know if you remember Benghazi. The year 2014, 2015 was under the control of ISIS. And unfortunately, he has a 1-year-old daughter that she turned 1 the day he was buried. So it's very ugly dynamic that we worry about, her psychosocial well-being in the future. And my mom is the reason I do all of what I do. She died in the year 2016. She had dementia, she has a liver failure. And when my sister said, "Mom is in the ICU," I took the first plane. Took me 5 different planes to reach the city of Benghazi. But thank God I spent 1 week with her, and she died holding my hand. I'm very much a mama's boy. So I was very blessed because she always told me, make sure you get busy mending broken hearts. If you cannot make somebody feel good, don't make them feel bad. So this is the work we do in Portland. We call it the Project Untangled. It focuses on education, psychosocial healing, focuses on training staff, and some of the healing that we do is clinical, but usually only like for a small percentage of people who need specialized care. The most successful program, as I mentioned, is the use of safe spaces. But today I wanted to give more space and more voice to everybody in the room, so I will stop here. Thank you.